Hello, in this video, I want to continue the series that we've been doing with Baudrillard and space privatization. This has been a really interesting series to me because I feel like in some of the other resolutions, especially the ones that have come out for LD, I haven't always been able to go as deeply or have longer series that are really about the postmodern sectors of the topic. And I think that there's definitely a lot of interest or ability to kind of make those things really viable in the context of space, because I think that space is so tied to a lot of the fictional or more imaginative genres that postmodernism really pulls from in order to draw a lot of its arguments about cultural imagery and symbolic imagery and the power of those things. And I think that that Baudrillard's particular criticism about the way in which simulacra function and the kind of idea of just public imaginaries and stuff like that is particularly useful in the context of space, especially in a world where the resolution is pushing towards a more public controlled or kind of public emphasized version of what space looks like. And so in this video, I kind of want to continue some of the work that we were doing in the last video, which I definitely think you should watch, where I kind of start talking about how policy teams should be responding to Baudrillard. I think that in that video, there were a lot of really interesting really interesting stuff that you'll need for this video, because it kind of frames some of the top level priorities, the framing arguments and the thesis arguments that I really think are most important for how you should be kind of getting to some of the more specific line by line concerns that we'll be talking about in this video, with the link to permutation, impact, comparison, and alternative. So make sure you tune in to kind of get that top level understanding, so you kind of get what we're kind of doing to kind of have the conversation that we're having here, and hopefully they'll kind of be able to draw on each other and build on each other, so you have a better understanding of what to do overall. I think in the context of in the context of what we should be doing for things the link debate. The link debate, I think, is actually a much more important portion of the debate than I feel like a lot of policy teams give it credit for, which is something I said in the videos about why Baudrillard or the negative could be such a good strategy. I feel oftentimes, especially in LD, because of how spread out the debates are, there are so often times that I see debaters really jettisoning, really doing specific nuanced responses to link arguments, and they either kind of have this just large kind of thesis for the no link argument that they're using to kind of getting out of this, or I think that I think that a really good way to think about the debate is that a lot of the ways that the other teams kind of situate it is by just jettisoning the link debate in full and trying to just win more of an impact turn based debate or a kind of top level strategy based debate. And I think that being able to kind of think through how you're able to answer the link specifically could be super helpful, because this is the place where I think that developing that kind of first strategy that I said that was a priority in the last video can be really helpful here, which is that I really think that part of being the link arguments is making a lot of differences between privatized and public space missions. I feel although the teams may have links about why space overall, for instance, might be bad, or why private interests in space might be bad, or even why certain public interests are bad, I don't think that in the context of Baudrillard specifically, there are a lot of comparative arguments about the difference between private and public space entities. And so I feel there's a kind of slippage here in the language that they're using in terms of thinking about the development of space that doesn't think about the necessary kind of shift in policy that a lot of the affirmatives are kind of thinking about. And I think that's a place where you should be bringing out a lot of your offense and showing that there's a lot of applicability to the idea that a refusal of privatized space means that there's more openness towards a different way of relating to space that isn't based off of an individualized idea of mobility that kind of allows us to think about sacrificing more resources on Earth and more populations, etc., and thus kind of gears to our policymaking as a whole towards a different type of ethos for how we're using that as a whole. I then think combining that with some of the inevitability arguments from the last video when we were talking about how the questions of things like collision, the necessity of certain technology to keep Earth sustainable, etc., also come from the ability from us to explore and develop different types of content, different types of technology and things like that for space, can offer really interesting ways for you to win really good link turn arguments, or at least arguments that allow you to really situate for the specific comparisons that start some of that impact debate earlier on, and thus make it a lot easier for you to apply maybe some of the arguments that you're making about your impact scenarios and impact calculus as a whole easier later on as the debate goes. I then think that when you're trying to move into things for instance the permutation debate, a lot of the arguments that I feel you need to be working on here are either trying to figure out ways that you can win, that the permutation operates through understanding that we should kind of understand how capitalism and hypercapitalist modes of using space have kind of infected public imagery and have infected policy, and the 1AC kind of operates as a way to kind of start the step away from that kind of system. Or I think that you should kind of be focusing your time more on using the permutation as a test of competition, because in that sense you can use a lot of the impact comparison that you kind of have about what's coming now and what are the kind of stakes that are at hand materially when you're winning kind of the thesis of the affirmative, and why those things mean that the alternative either needs a way to resolve these things, or it has to deal with the full weight of the impact calculus of the affirmative, which makes it a lot more plausible that if you're kind of winning some of these top level concerns about how the judge should be viewing and understanding why the skills of making the types of policy decisions that you want is necessarily good, then it's a lot easier for you to win these debates, even if the perm doesn't end up as like the overall kind of like strategy for the 2AR, or like the one that kind of like wins you the debate in totality. I then think that when you go to impact comparison, this is a really important part of the debate, because I feel like for Baudrillard teams, they can develop additional critiques on the way that you do impact calculus by indicting the way that you're relating to the future, indicting the way that you're, I think about like being able to have humans survive at all costs. But I do think there are a lot of arguments to make about like why, even if at a level like, for instance, you don't have to defend things like hardcore utilitarianism, the ability to have a principle of just defending why things like human life are valuable in the abstract, and why debate, for instance, shouldn't be the place where we make decisions about like all human life and whether or not it's valuable, can be really good arguments for you to kind of like situate and forward the debate to kind of like make as a fundamental basis for just like why we should evaluate like what deaths are like more plausible than others. I definitely think it would be like really important for you to, for instance, to say that, for instance, the idea that we should just kind of like allow various types of populations that are suffering from the worst impacts, especially ones that come from like that have populations that suffer with like infrastructure issues that would stop things like being able to like help in the context of like emergency or other kind of like impact scenarios, could be really interesting ways of why you push that the idea of being able to make the decision that those things are just part of our ability to kind of like continue along this process of simulation is like a really big undersight in terms of thinking about at least the plausibility that these things could happen and that those lives are valuable. And I think that making a lot of arguments with the why those things are particularly valuable is super important in order for you to kind of like situate for the judge like why they should be thinking about your calculus outside the terms of whether or not you just have like the bigger number, and just thinking about like what are overall the kind of like landscape is for like why the impact is important in the first place. And then I think when you're able to win that impact comparison, a lot of the pressure that you'll then start applying to the alternative will come a lot more naturally, because you can have a lot more arguments both about why they don't solve your impact scenarios, but also why in a world where they don't really have a way to operationalize space, things could get necessarily worse, and they have to deal with like the worst kind of impacts of both the status quo and the ability of the plan not passing. And I think that those and those kind of like conditions in general will make it a lot harder for teams to not have a lot of that alt development, or will not allow you to kind of like push a lot of the things that you need in order to make sure that that alternative is in a place where it at least has like some examples that you can start to make offense off of, and thus you have a lot more things to kind of like debate about and put in the judge's mind as a whole. Hopefully this video has been helpful for you, and hopefully you'll tune into more videos I'll be doing with different forms of like Baudrillard, postmodernism, LD skills, all types of stuff. And yeah, thank you as always for tuning in.